LinkedIn, so I don't want to take up time on that one. I will just say that I think it's really interesting that Sean and I are partnering together because of our backgrounds. And there is so much that history could teach us, and there's so much that we need to really understand in order to make forward movement into the future and be successful. The concept of psychological safety was actually developed by a woman by the name of Amy Edmondson back in 1999. She's from the Harvard Business School. And since then, her concept has just gone on to receive a lot more attention by a lot more scholars on this topic. And we're going to talk a little bit about trauma later on, but we all know that we come to work as a whole person and not just as the professional side. And as a whole person, it is quite common for us to bring any kind of trauma that we have endured as people into that workplace, whether we do it intentionally or not. That's part of who we are. And so that to me is even more important of building a case around psychological safety in the workplace, because some of us are already coming to that kind of gun shy. And we're really hoping that we can be in a workplace that is going to hear us, that's going to make us feel safe, that we're feeling like we can give candid feedback, that there's an environment that's mistakes are being admitted, and there's no kind of repercussion that would take place when we are honest about things like that. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to you, Sean, and talk a little bit go deeper into today's conversation. And if any time we're saying something that you want to, again, comment on, just simply raise your hand and we'll move you to that other spot here in this live event. And that way you're able to talk. Okay. Thanks, Sean.
All right. Well, welcome to everybody who's listening. And as Tracie said, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. I don't have a spiel, so you're not going to knock me off my rhythm. So questions are always good and welcome. All right. So what is it about the historical perspective? I'll just say about a minute's worth of material about this topic here. I look at the past as being a sort of a treasure trove, a sort of a treasure box, if you will, of our human experience. It's a record of everything that's worked in our past, and it's a record of everything that hasn't worked. So why shouldn't we access all of that information? We have a stunning amount of data available. And although we've developed as a civilization over the millennia, we're still human. And what unites us with our ancestors is much stronger than what doesn't unite us. So we have this whole record of material that we can work with. And the past sort of acts as, I guess you could say, as like sort of silent coaches that we can interact with and sort of bounce our ideas off of if we know how to do it. So I think it's worth looking into the past to see how this question of psychological safety predates 1999 as an idea in human history. And I'd like to start off by saying that I think one of the problems that modern business people, corporate people, or startups, whatever you're working in, is they hear a term like psychological safety, and I think a lot of people just sort of disregard it. They scoff. They say, oh, it's got nothing to do with making money. It's got nothing to do with beating the competition. It sounds kind of airy-fairy and, whatever. And so what happens is I think a lot of people either just nod and promise they'll implement the procedures and then they don't, or they part implement them, or arguably what's worse, they implement them, but they don't believe in them. They just say, okay, we believe you, we'll listen to what you have to say, but they're not really showing that they do. Or perhaps even worse yet, we have certain leaders who will implement these things, but they'll do it out of self-interest. They'll do it because they want to be noticed by HR. They say, hey, look, you see how good I'm doing, how forward-thinking I am. But again, they don't really care about what's going on. So I think it's worth it to look at this as a sort of a question of the longue durée, as they say, to show that this is not some new initiative. This is not something that's superficial. It actually goes back thousands and thousands of years, actually, when you look at it, just by a different name. So kicking off, we'll start with a kind of an extreme example here. A lot of people think that psychological safety is inherently good. After all, we have the word safety in there. And psychological is the adjective. So you think, oh, psychological safety, that's exactly what we need. That's what I want. And if you're implementing psychological safety techniques, you must be a good person. You must be involved in a good organization. So I would say that that's a little bit misleading. I would argue that psychological safety is actually morally neutral, right? So it's neither good nor bad. It's a bit like nuclear power. You can use it to build bombs and you can use it to build power plants. So I think we have plenty of examples of how organizations use this for the good, hospitals helping people, doing research into medical science and so on. But if you consider a very famous negative example, that of the Nazi Party in the 1920s and 1930s, they created conditions of psychological safety for their own people. They gave license to the bigots and the racists and the haters and the people who wanted to espouse violence to have a safe place in the first instance to meet in their little rooms and their little beer halls and to give each other a safe space to air their grievances. Of course, they weren't using softy language with each other. They were, quite gruff, rough people. But within their own terms, they were giving each other a psychological safe space where they won't be mocked for voicing their extremist opinions. And then, of course, when the party came to power in 1933, they essentially licensed society to act on its worst instincts. And then after 1935, it was a requirement for you to act on your worst instincts, in fact, with the Nuremberg laws. So we can see this in action, again, sticking with this sort of 20th century dark history with something that's in German is called Auftragstaktik. So after the war started, we're talking about here, how did the German war machine fight its wars, right? So Auftragstaktik is actually something that goes back to the early 18th century, but it came to full fruition in the First and the Second World War, especially with the Second World War. And it can be translated, the translation in English is a bit rough. It means something like tactics based on task solving, which is a bit of a mouthful. But what it said is basically this, that authority, and by the way, it's worth investigating this in some detail because this shows how psychological safety reflects and works together with other things that you need to be a good leader, like, for instance, devolution of authority and how that works together. So what Auftragstaktik said was that an individual leader, sort of halfway up the chain, isn't going to necessarily know what's going on at the very front, right? So the best way to solve this problem is to devolve authority down to the people who are actually on the front line. And they were licensed and authorized to take decisions and to implement them without having to kick everything upstairs first and ask for permission and go to a whole big sequence of meetings and so on. So what happened was the middle management would say something like, all right, look, we have to seize this objective by this date. Now you go and do it and make it happen, right? And just keep us in the loop. So it's based on communication laterally and back upstairs to the middle management, so to speak, right? And that technique proved continuously so successful that in the case of the Nazis and their war machine, they reached the gates of Moscow, they reached the Volga River and Stalingrad against a vastly superior army on paper. So it was quite effective. Now, the contrasting example is the Soviet army under Stalin. So the Soviets had just finished this thing that historians call the Great Terror. So we won't go into the politics of it, but basically people were afraid, as you can imagine. People were being shot on, spurious pretexts and so on. So organizationally, what you have is a bunch of traumatized people in the army who are terrified of speaking out. They're terrified of being reported for things they may not even have done, let alone things they did do. And so initiative was absolutely stifled, right? Everything had to be kicked upstairs, and it was basically a big back-end covering exercise. So the result was that the German army, which was inferior on paper, actually drove all the way to the gates of Moscow because the Soviet system was so cumbersome and so difficult to manage. Of course, eventually the Soviets won the war. The Germans were completely defeated. But the interesting thing to notice here is the casualty ratios. So the Germans lost the military casualties. The Germans lost about 5.5 million people in that war. And the Soviets lost about 12 million military personnel in that war. Now, traditionally, throughout all of history, the winning side usually has fewer casualties. In fact, that's one of the definitions of winning, is that you've gotten rid of more of your enemies and you lost yourself in the process. So you occupied the ground at losses that were to your advantage. So the Soviets lost almost 3 times as many people as the Germans, and they won. That's the exact opposite of what you would expect. And I think, having studied this for a while, that one of the key reasons behind that is the fact that the Soviet system never got rid of their culture of fear. They never got rid of the culture of kicking everything upstairs and covering your backside and being afraid to speak out, being afraid to make suggestions, because if you made a suggestion and it didn't work, you were a good candidate for being shot or being sent to the camps. In the Nazi system, they used what we would call psychological safety and encouraged their people to feed back and to keep in communication, keep in the loop, and to devolve authority as much as possible. And they were militarily quite successful given the limitations of their armed forces. So I think what we're looking at here is psychological safety being used for a bad purpose, the Nazi cause, but it being highly effective nonetheless. And I think that shows the power of psychological safety. It also shows that the idea is not new. It's a matter of life and death sometimes, as in this case. And I think that if you are in any doubt about whether this is an effective thing to put into place in your company, I hope that example, even by itself, is enough to show that this is really something to seriously consider and not just go through the motions or half implement it. So, okay, I'll pause there to let everyone catch their breath and pause it for questions or follow up.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, for those of you that are listening, if you have an insight that you want to share or a question, let's do that. I got a question for you, Sean.
Yeah.
You said the fewer casualty number usually equals the side that wins. Yes.
Normally, traditionally, for thousands
Yeah,
of years, that
the
tended to be the case.
fewer.
Yeah.
And you said that the Germans lost about 5.5 million.
Something like that, military casualties, yeah.
But did they win or did they
And
lose?
they lost. They lost
Okay.
catastrophically, and their capital was occupied, and their leader was burnt in a hole in the ground. And
Yeah.
so it wasn't like they lost in the sense of like, oh, we lost this game. So but
Right.
they was a catastrophic defeat. So they
Yes.
really should have suffered by far the higher casualty numbers.
So my question is there any kind of analogy or some kind of, I don't know, parallel we can draw when you're talking about casualty from war in the context of work environment, today's work, a casualty of war, might that be considered to be turnover in an organization?
We could call it turnover. We could call it people who sabotage the company through, showing up late or consciously not doing the job properly or looking for other employment all the time. Or even, if you want to go far enough, it's people who, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have humor in the office. God knows we need that as an engine. But nevertheless, when you see a lot of people in the company, making the thank God it's Friday and I hate Mondays kinds of jokes, you have to ask yourself why that is. I mean, if people are spending so much time so much of a portion of their life at work, why is it that these jokes keep surfacing and never go away? And if your business is filled with that, oh, Jesus, this again, there's something not working properly.
No.
Right? And it's probably going to be related to psychological safety in some way, because it usually is.
Right. Well, if we're working in a place that we cannot give candid feedback, we're afraid to admit our mistakes, we don't want to learn from those mistakes, then we're afraid to take chances. We're not going to your point, we're not going to take initiative. And if I'm coming into work with that kind of mindset, I can't wait for Fridays and I dread Mondays.
Right. You have no investment in the system.
No. Right? And I'm afraid. Can you all believe can you be afraid to do your job if you are afraid of making mistakes?
What you do, if we look at the Soviet example, to stick with the one example, if you look at what happened in Stalin's Soviet Union, yes, you can do your job. After all, the Soviets won the war, but they did so at that tremendous cost. They ought not have lost to that many people, right? So it will cost you, right? It will cost the people that the psychological health of the people you work with. Remember, a lot of the Soviet veterans came back and turned to alcohol and were traumatized by all of this. They weren't the happy, clappy people that they're portrayed in the propaganda films. So I think that what you're doing, if you're working in an office where you're afraid to speak out for whatever reason, if you're working in an office where fear plays a role in how you behave, then you've got problems with psychological safety. And then what you're doing historically is following the Soviet model, right?
Yes.
But why would you run your company into the ground, even if you nominally achieve victory? You're doing it at a cost that's going to make that victory barely worth it. And don't forget, the Soviet Union fell finally in 1991, and that the mortal wound was inflicted by the Germans. It just took them a long time to die. So we have to remember this as well. So it's just not worth it. You're stifling initiative. You're denying your company the power that it has through the power of its individual employees. So why would you do that? If you're afraid to hear feedback, what does that say about you as a leader?
What does it say?
It says that you're conscious that you're not that competent. There's something wrong. You have to have praise built in, right? You can't hear a hard truth. And what these leaders fail to understand is that the hard truth might be the road to victory.
Wow.
Right?
That is interesting. Do you know that studies show that the farther down we go in the organization. So for instance, if we are in a role that is closest to the customer or the patient, whatever, depending on what kind of job what industry you work in, the farther down you get, the less psychological safety you feel.
Mm-hmm.
That's what studies show. Studies show that 42% of managers feel psychologically safe compared to 57% of executives.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you suppose that would be the case?
I think there's a couple of reasons. Number one, the people lower down the totem pole are perceived to be expendable, and the people who are at the entry level understand that they're expendable, right?
Oh no, that's a
Now,
great point.
now that's not actually factually necessarily true, but that's the
Mm-hmm.
perception, right? So I just got hired. The interview process was just a couple of interviews. I was taken on easily. I can be thrown out easily, right? So if I rock the boat, well, it's easier to get rid of the guy rocking the boat than it is to rebuild the boat, right? So everybody sort of understands this, right? And that was true back in the 1930s and 40s. And this analogy I've been giving you, the higher up you are, the more you have invested in the company and the more valuable you are. But I'll give you this point. There's a phrase that I devised. It's called the horizon of memory. And the horizon of memory is how far back any one person can see in the company, right?
Mm.
And that continuity is vital for company success, because the person who's been there a long time, if they're reasonably reflective, will know what has worked and what hasn't worked, right, over the long period, right, 20 or 30 years. And that horizon of memory, if you can raise that horizon of memory and see further over the horizon backwards, you have a value that is tremendous. And the person who joined last week they don't have any memory at all of the company. They don't know what worked, what didn't work. So they can be more easily swapped in and out. So they feel vulnerable because they know that this must be true at some level, right? Now, I would say that it's the leader's responsibility, like it was in these Prussian and then later German armies, to give across the idea that although the leadership does have this elevated horizon of memory, it's their job to make the lower down people who lack that horizon of memory feel like their contribution is valued. And the way I think that can be done is to take the leaf right from the German Army handbook, which is to say that the person who's on the front line, i.e. not the general, but the private soldier, the guy on the front line knows best what's going on. He's at the coalface, right? He's dealing with customers, he's dealing with clients, he's dealing with product development. And every day, right in front of his face, the person who's higher up is looking at more strategic issues, of course. So if there's an acknowledgement that, look, although you're new, your value is different from mine, right? But you're still quite valuable because you're the one who's plugged into the wall, so to speak. You're the one who's at the coalface, at the front lines, right? Without you, I couldn't do anything. And I think if that idea was brought across more clearly, that without you, I can't do anything as a leader, then
Mm-hmm.
people would feel much more secure and much more valued in their jobs. So it's about
Wow.
leadership not standing on top of the pyramid and dictating and saying, look how far I can see. It's acknowledging that you can see farther, your horizon of memory is greater, but you wouldn't be able to see it all if it wasn't for all the stones at the bottom of the pyramid, right? And so your
Oh
leadership should
my.
become the act of leading through your people, right? So I'm here to serve my people and help them lead fulfilling lives at work. And if I view my leadership as a service rather than a dictatorship, well, now you're going to go places.
Wow.
You
That's
know?
great. That's so great. That is wonderful. Yeah, there's you made a comment about maybe the reason why executives feel more safe than the folks that are there in the trenches is because the perception is the people in the trenches are expendable, and that is
Mm-hmm.
like you just said that to me. I don't know how all of you felt when you said that, but that made me just like almost cringe,
Mm-hmm.
almost cringe. Like
Mm-hmm.
we if one leaves, we got 10 more. It's totally fine. We don't need to
Mm-hmm.
change. That's crazy.
But look what happens when you have an army that's based on that principle, right? You've got something like Putin's army today in the invasion of Ukraine. We don't have to look back that far. This is an army that's quite happy and willing to throw away the lives of its people, of its best people, the people who volunteered, right? We could even say. They can't keep it up forever. And what kind of a
Oh,
reputation do you have? Look at us looking from the outside in. Who's the brave
wow.
army? It's the Ukrainians who value the life of each individual soldier. We look
Hmm.
down our noses at the Russians who are quite happy to throw away their people. And that's just us looking in from the outside. So imagine
That
that,
is
being your company, having that reputation. You don't
wow.
you
That
want to
is
avoid that at
crazy.
all costs,
Yeah, That is crazy. There was a huge study by Google. I don't know if you're all familiar with this. It's called the Aristotle study, and it was massive, and it was a lot to do with psychological safety. And if you're unfamiliar with the report, there is a lot of great information out there on the internet to learn more about that. But I really thought that their research helped to move the topic forward because it was really, as I said, a very very big report. Some findings that come from that is the blame game. At least 40% of people that responded in higher level positions um, indicated that their mistakes were held against them, possibly due to their increased visibility across the organization, compared to individual contributors, 29%. So when we think about psychological safety, there's different parts of that. There's different pieces that make up that. On one hand, executives felt more safe than, let's say, middle management. But on the other hand, with regard to safety, a part of that safety piece, you see it flipped. You see that if you were higher up, you were unsure that if you did make a mistake, that was going to be widespread or it was going to be broadcasted, and then they very very afraid to do that. Versus middle managers, less visibility. Uh, Sean, do you have any another example or more of those examples that you gave us that you could maybe talk about?
Yeah, sure. In fact,
Yeah.
you said the word guilt, and I immediately didn't have to go very far. We could stick with the same sort of Soviet and German conflict back in the 40s. So there's a phrase known to every Soviet person when anything goes wrong: "Kto vinovat?" Who's guilty? That's the first go-to question, right? So something went
Uh-huh.
wrong. Who's guilty? Not who's responsible even, but who's guilty, right? And you have to find the guilty person and get rid of them. They're a saboteur. They're an enemy. They're some kind of person who's there to prevent you from achieving your goal. There was never any emphasis on, oh, something went wrong, how can we improve? So you look at the death figures and you see that's the result. I mean, it's just there. I mean, the evidence is looking at us right in plain sight, right? So if you play the blame game playing the blame game in the sense of saying this person has to be punished, right? It's not my fault, it's their fault, right? That's going to create a Soviet-style system for you, right? As simple as that. If you seek who is responsible for it in the sense of trying to fix the problem so that it doesn't happen again, and we learn something from it, then it's... So imagine if you thanked the person who screwed up, saying, thank you for doing this, because now you've shown us where our weak point is.
Yes.
Right? So we hadn't seen this weakness in our system before, but now you screwed up, either semi-intentionally or accidentally or just through whatever the reason is. You showed us our weak point. Now we can fix that. Thank you. Now, presumably, you also feel embarrassed and you pay more attention next time, or whatever the case happens to be. But the point is not on punishing the guilty person. The point is on saying, look, you're part of us. You're part of the group. Everybody makes an honest mistake. Don't worry. And thank you for advancing our company's cause by showing us where we can improve and do better, right? So that's a tremendous value. Now imagine if you put that throughout the whole system, right? People are going to feel immediately more valued. Saying, even if I mess up, I'm going to have, someone's going to have my back and we'll be able to learn from it.
Yes.
And that's what history shows us. We would just have to look at the history of the Second World War, and the whole story is right out there, laid out.
Right out there. Wow. Wow. I love that question. What if you asked that question? What if you addressed when somebody made a mistake in a way that allowed them to feel like they weren't going to be reprimanded, or there was not going to be any negative repercussions? Psychological safety is not about being nice.
Correct.
No, it's about being candid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if you go with this, sorry to interrupt you, Trace, just while you're on this point, when you take that point into consideration, taking a look at this history that we're discussing, you could imagine that these Soviet and German soldiers in the trenches were not, quote, nice. They weren't saying, oh, Johan, that was well done, please feel free. Yeah. They were shouting at each other, but that was the culture that they lived in. It was acceptable to speak in that way because the idea was to advance the cause.
Mm-hmm.
That's the idea. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes. No, sorry. Please don't apologize. I think that's great. So we've 5 minutes left before we're going to end today's live event. And I want to, this is my background is organizational development, and a great deal of that has to do with culture. And my feeling is that, Sean, the folks that have joined us today are here for a few, like one or two reasons, really, or maybe three. You want to learn how to build psychological safety into your culture, You want to learn that for yourself as a leader. You're looking to get tips and tricks on how to do that. I mean, those are the reasons I think you're on this. You're part of this, and so we always want to leave with some sort of call to action, and then a few tips and tricks that we are going to offer you. So I want to give you, and then I'll pass it back over to you, Sean. I want to give you, there are a lot of different tools out there to help build psychological safety, and culture exists everywhere. And it really does, culture is really all about the values that we have, the morals and values. And culture takes time to shift, to change. So here's 7 questions, and I will send this out afterwards. 7 question kind of survey you can ask the team, and this is really to help really get psychological safety to take root within the organization or the workplace that you're in. If you make a mistake on your team, is it held against you? Are you able to bring up problems and tough issues? Do people on the team sometimes reject others for being different? Is it safe to take a risk? Is it difficult to ask other team members for help? Do people on the team deliberately act to undermine your efforts? Are your unique skills and talents valued and utilized? If you ask those questions of just yourself, or answered those questions, and the answers would be no, then for me to tell you, it is a red flag to ask yourself, what's worse than being in an environment that has no psychological safety? What's worse than that is being in that environment another day longer. So this is not a call to action to say quit your job. It is a call to action to say what can we do, all of us, to help build a culture that is psychological safety. Big part of that. It's there. So Sean, I'd love for you to close us out today.
Yes, I will try and do this. I'm trying to take a big bite and try and chew it quickly here. I'll give you a sort of an ancient Greek perspective and then my own perspective. So,
Okay.
one of the ideas that the Greeks gave us, certain Greek philosophers gave us, is the idea of ethical leadership, moral leadership. And what does it mean? And they viewed ethical leadership as being leadership which recognizes that you are leading a community, and your job is to, as a leader, is to protect that community, number one, and number two, to ensure that each member of the community thrives so that the health of the community continues to thrive, right? So you as the leader are serving the individual people in the community by protecting them, which is psychological safety, and encouraging each member to thrive. And my own contribution to this is to say, if you're in doubt as to what technique you should use, how you should handle a certain situation, consider this metaphor. When people go on stage to speak, they often get nervous, right? They're trying to remember all the lines, remember the points, and it becomes very much focused on them, right? How will I perform on stage? How will I deliver the speech? How will I not forget something, right? But instead, put yourself in the following mindset. Just imagine that somebody comes up to you on the street and asks for directions, right? So where's the train station? Now, whether or not you know where the train station is, you're going to be flattered to ask, and you're going to help that person, even if it means walking out of your way and, together finding somebody else who knows where it is. You're going to help the person, and it feels good to help them. What you don't feel is nervous. You're not looking at yourself. You're looking at the other person's problem and how you might help them solve that problem. So if you have a situation where you sense that there is not sufficient psychological safety in the workplace, to ask yourself, how can I help my people to feel secure? So don't put the emphasis so much on what technique can I use, or what kind of feedback I might get or something like that. Let that come second. The first thing you should do, in my opinion anyway, is ask yourself, how can I be of service to this person to help them feel secure? And so the linchpin of this whole thing is communication, right? Without two-way, open, honest communication, you're going to have problems. And that was the key to that Aufstrahls tactics that the Germans developed. The communication had to be there both ways. It couldn't work with just one-way communication. So feel like you have to focus on communication first, getting to the heart of what's bothering people if you discover a problem, and serve the people that you're leading, right? Create that safe space, create that safe city state where each member of your community is allowed to flourish. And if you keep that as your goal, then you'll be following the great Greek philosophers, right? At the very least, you'll have good company in your approach to solving the problem, right? and you'll find that it works. I mean, it's been around for thousands of years, so it's just a case of plugging into that tradition and fearlessly using it.
I love that. Thank you, Sean. It's been so
Pleasure.
much fun. It's so much fun. We hope that you got some value out of today's live event, and we will follow up again with some resources. They'll be in that thread to this event. So hopefully you'll be able to get that. And again, if you have any questions or you want to have further conversation, feel free to reach out to Sean or myself. Sean, preferably if you want to talk about history.
I'm always happy
And
to talk about the past. So
yes, 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 yes. Have a great day, everybody, and spread the word if you like this live event. And we'll be having more. Thank you so
great.
much. Have a great
Thanks,
day.
everybody. Bye bye.
Bye, y'all.